Hello and welcome. I am Jane McPherson. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Georgia. And it is really my pleasure and delight to be here to moderate this panel number 11 today. Welcome back from lunch. This has been just a remarkable symposium so far. I hope that all of you have been able to be here. I haven't been able to remove myself from my seat. Every minute is valuable. And I know that this session, From Archives to Performance, the Meaning of Slavery, will only, add to that wonder. So I'm going to quickly just discuss this panel. We are going to have two presentations today: Performance and Archives of Slavery, Pedagogical Collaborations between Georgia and Martinique, that features 4 speakers who have really agreed to push all of their wonderful material into a very brief period of time. So that is Jennifer Palmer, Emily Sahakian, LeKynik Meyer, and Daja M. Rice. They will speak first for about half an hour, and then there will be a seamless transition to Caden, who will present her performance, The Lost Tape, from archive to audio play. Because they are putting so much material into a very brief time, our panelists are going to try to take some Q&A and chat, and we believe that there will be a few minutes left for Caroline in the end, and I'll be looking at the questions as well, but please do add your questions. We'll try to address some, and please enjoy these next wonderful performances and presentations.
Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you to all of the symposium organizers and participants. I have found this event to be arresting and transformative, and I'm honored that we can be a part of it. Here comes my screen. Okay, can you see? Co-panelists, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to briefly introduce our project today, which is a research and teaching project, a collaborative project between the University of Georgia and the University of the Antilles in Martinique, which is an island in the French-speaking Caribbean. The project is international, and it is additionally interdisciplinary in that we're working across history, theater and performance studies, and Francophone studies. We are using our bodies, we are exploring archives creatively, and we're reflecting on our positionality, and with that, asking how can we ethically make meaning together in our combined classes from archives of slavery. So these are the main collaborators. The 3 project directors are Dr. Dominique Roger, or Rogers, if you like in English, a historian at the University of the Antilles, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. Dr. Jennifer Palmer, historian at the University of Georgia, and myself, I am jointly appointed in theater and film studies and romance languages. It was most important to us that you hear today from our students. We are joined today by 2 outstanding graduate students, LeKynik Meyer, who received her MA in French in 2020, and Daja M. Rice, who just received her MFA in performance. In addition to being in the classes with us, and we call our classes laboratories, in which we collectively generate knowledge, in addition to the classwork, both Kai and Daja have done extra work for this project. Kai trained in linguistics, studied linguistics, and translated several of the archival documents for us. And Daja used the technique of performing the archive in her performance thesis project. This research and teaching occurs under an agreement signed with the University of the Antilles in 2019. And thank you to our colleague, Carolyn for also helping that to happen. I want to acknowledge the influence of the Georgia Incarceration Performance Project on this work. The two projects were unfolding simultaneously. A big shout out to all of my amazing collaborators, and especially to my dynamite colleague, Dr. Amagartitago-Kuten, whose methodology of performing the archive certainly influenced the work that we do in this project. I want to very briefly share some of my goals. We get close to the archival documents. We creatively explore what we can access, how we can and cannot access and interpret the past. Oops. We reflect on our own positioning vis-a-vis histories and legacies of slavery. We think about post-slave societies between Georgia and Martinique. In thinking across cultures, national contexts, and languages, we can better understand our own society as well as learn about the other society. Collaboration, cultural exchange, and friendship are important to knowledge production. Collaboration is not easy. It requires time, it requires effort, it requires understanding that you can't reduce someone, as Edouard Glissant might say, to a truth that they would not have generated on their own. Performance also helps us to see slavery as a global, ongoing story. The repetitions and reinventions of colonial anti-Black violence and resistance, the repetitions of the resistance as well. So we're about to hear from our graduate students, but undergraduate students as well did many kinds of creative work. Here are a few examples here. And some of the things that they took away were seeing slavery as the world's burden to bear, saying that these collaborations allowed them to develop morals and values in order to avoid repeating history, and taking the work as a call to action. One of them saying you need to advocate for the unheard, otherwise you're part of the larger issue. A student, Bailey Sharp, also prepared a short video that, and I can share the link in the chat, for the fall class. So I would now like to pass it along to LeKynik Meyer, who will begin a position as a French teacher at Roger Bacon High School in Cincinnati, Ohio in the fall.
Thank you, Dr. Sahakian. Good afternoon. So I was brought on to transcribe and translate the French Caribbean Archives of Slavery to help get this project off its feet. The archives that I transcribed and translated were records of court cases, baptisms, and sales of slaves from the 18th century. And I want to say briefly, I was very interested in this work because I have somewhat of a personal connection. As with many Black Americans, the history of my African origins is unknown. I have been told that my great-grandmother said that her people were not slaves in the United States, but were from the islands, possibly the Caribbean. Therefore, these archives that I would be working with were from a region where I believe part of my ancestry may be linked. So this whole process of transcription and to translation, I approached it methodically. I had to create a system that I followed for each document to ensure my efficiency. So as you can see, here's one of them that I was able to translate. First, I had to make out the words simply from the images and then document them. As you can see, it was not a very easy task as the handwriting was not always legible and not every document was written by the same scribe. So the handwriting or penmanship was different. At times there were blurry areas or letters that didn't have a lot of recognizable form. And sometimes I just couldn't make out a letter or a word. So after transcribing the French, I needed to cross-check spelling and grammar to make sure that it fit in this 18th century time period. There was quite a bit of research actually involved in this transcription and translation process. At this point though, as you can see on the image, these documents were just words to me at the time. Now, when I moved on to the work of translating, it was very different. Once translated from French to English, I had to reread over and over my translations to make sure that the same message was being conveyed in English, considering the nature and the time period of these legal archives. The act of rereading made me begin to feel and imagine. And at points, I became very emotional as I imagined these human beings being discussed and described as property within these documents. I could only imagine what it was really like living that life. I began to play out and visualize these stories and the recounts of these events in my mind. And attached to these images were overwhelming feelings of sadness and pain. Later, I would get to transform those images and thoughts into something more visible through the seminar, interpreting French slavery in the Caribbean, led by Dr. Palmer and Dr. Sahakian. I would say that the seminar itself was centered around experience. It allowed me to analyze, discuss, and question French slavery in the Caribbean in non-traditional ways. We used performance-based techniques and theatrical techniques to interpret not only the archives, but literature, history, and sociological studies as well. The methods that we practice in class collaboratively with classmates allowed me to embody, give visible form to my interpretation of these documents. I felt like I was bringing them back to life in a sense. When performing, I would try to capture what I thought these people felt in my facial expressions, gestures, poses, and voice. Once during an exercise, we staged kind of like statues, posed like statues, the baptism of a slave mother's child whose father was the maître or master. We had to decide where the mother and child might have been standing in relation to the father, godparents, clergy, all while questioning what their proximities to each other could have indicated or revealed, such as their positions or relationships to each other. All of this was being done based on the little information that we had from the baptism record. And it brought up so many questions and led to extensive and intense discussions. I have to be honest, throughout this whole process, this experience, it didn't feel right because I didn't know if my interpretations were correct and if my assumption, and honestly, my assumptions were being challenged as well. I even asked myself, I remember during the baptism staging, was the mother disgusted and repulsed by her master, as I assumed? And maybe in this case, there were feelings of affection between these two individuals. And so there were tons of unanswered questions, of course, and holes and silences. And Michel Trouillot, a Haitian anthropologist whose book we studied, Silencing the Past, says that silences enter the process of history production at 4 crucial moments, including during the making of the archives. And without going into it too much, with the archives that we worked with, those who were in power at the time, white men, made and created these archives. And I think it would be fair to say that they didn't accurately represent the perspectives of the slaves, as considering they probably weren't involved in the process. Yet we were still, or I was still able to analyze and question what was there. And because I had a more, I guess, physical interaction or experience with the archives, the type of questioning I developed was different than when I analyzed in more traditional ways. It opened up new perspectives on the lives of these individuals when I embodied these documents. I questioned feelings, motives, and relationships in more depth. Again, it also really challenged my assumptions based on my own personal lived experiences. And finally, there was another enriching aspect to the seminar, which was the seminar and the project was the collaboration with the students from the University of the Antilles. Along with another UGA student, I had the pleasure of working with a young woman named Camille. We discussed briefly our experiences in school as it related to education on slavery, her being in the Martinique, me being in the United States. We agreed that it was not a subject that was openly discussed and studied. Additionally, she talked about how there still exists a racial hierarchy in her society, with the Beke, descendants of colonists, being at the top. It was interesting to see and discover how our worlds as two women of color were similar even across borders. Later, we discussed excerpts from Dr. Dominique Roger's Voix d'Esclave, which were script interrogations of slaves, again, from the 18th century. Again, we together during discussion acknowledged that these accounts were recorded by whites and may not have accurately represented the perspectives of slaves. Again, talked about lots of holes and silences. And we had questions, lots of them. One being, how was the essence of the slaves' responses during these interrogations? How were their responses captured if they were speaking a Creole, or if they couldn't speak French well? And so I guess we were questioning really the integrity of the documents as representation of the slaves' perspectives. But as we dove a little bit more we discussed how things could emerge despite these holes, such as a probable mother-daughter type relationship that may have existed between a female slave named Lucille and the daughters of her master. Lucille had been interrogated because she was accused of poisoning her master's livestock. She had been locked up for almost 2 years in a dungeon type cell. And when asked if her master visited her, she said, never. And when asked if his daughters would give her food, she answered, sometimes. She went on to say that usually it was her children who would slip her small pieces and bits of bread under the door. But I had to ask myself, what would have motivated the daughters of the master to give her food as well? And as a slave who lived with her master, it wasn't unlikely that she had to care for those girls like they were her own. But based on that one word, sometimes, another perspective on the life of this woman was revealed. So this collaboration with Camille was short-lived, but very, very enriching. So hopefully I have clearly articulated that this entire experience was positive, and the performative techniques that we used were very, very effective. And it was an effective approach, I should say, to analyzing historical documents in a non-traditional and in a different way. It was truly beyond words, beyond text, and it was an experience that, for me at least, provoked introspection and new perspectives on the lives of slaves. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful reflections, Kai. Next, we'll hear from Daja M. Rice, who will begin in the fall a position as theater director at Landmark Christian School. And I'm also putting her professional website into the chat for attendees and panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Sahakian. Hello, everyone. So as Dr. Sahakian mentioned, during this past fall semester, I had the opportunity to take her Topics in History course titled Performance and Histories of Slavery in the Americas. And we explored many thought-provoking and useful concepts as it pertains to slavery, slave history, and both its relevance to and reactivation through performance. But there was one methodology that stuck with me, and that was performing the archive. It was explicitly relevant to the work that I was doing with the fictional character of Cam May in Katori Hall's The Mountaintop for my thesis performance. And because the play reimagines a night in the life of a historical figure, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but conveys a message to its audience through Dr. King's interaction with a fictional character, Cam May, I wanted to discover how utilizing the methodology and practice of performing the archive could aid my delivery of an honest portrayal of a fictional character. So during my time, I'd like to highlight a few explorations from our class that informed and influenced my process and ultimately my performance. So performing the archive, what is it? In an interview for the National Archives UK, Professor Lisa Jardine stated, an archive is any collection of documents and sometimes objects that have been collected over a long period of time and largely hidden from view. She went on to say that one of the things about archives is they are, in her imagination, quite secret. And one of the things in going to them is to explore the secret of the archive. This became my working definition for the archive throughout my process, because as a Black female artist, this definition resonated with me deeply. I'm most interested in and oftentimes in the position to tell stories from a perspective about a narrative that has been often hidden in this country, that of a Black female. So when approaching this method, I wanted to utilize it not only to reactivate history, but to also reactivate history with the intention of it revealing a deeper level of truth that would influence the present. Now, how would I do that? Through fiction. Well, when being introduced to the practice of performing the archive, we first took time to discuss our current knowledge of history and how it came to be. So I shared that growing up, school was not a place where I learned much history with Black people at the center. Most of my knowledge of history was based on intergenerational storytelling, what I've heard from the elders of my family, like my Nana, who would spontaneously tell funny stories about what it was like growing up in the South during the 1940s and 50s, or my Uncle Tony, who always took on the task and found delight in collecting information about our family history and sharing it at the annual family reunions. I'm telling you guys, the Middleton and Waring family tree is ingrained in my brain. I can see it now as I'm talking to y'all. Or even esteemed artists who use storytelling as a way to transmit history, such as the late, great Cicely Tyson, my favorite, and her iconic role as Jane Pittman, or even her fictional role as Mama Flora in Mama Flora's Family. By keeping my ears open to the recollections of generations before me, I've had the opportunity to be educated about where and who I come from. So this initial question was important to my thesis process because, as I stated, in The Mountaintop, Dr. King is at the center of that story. And he was a man that we know as the king, esteemed highly, idolized, even seemingly placed on this pedestal for all to worship him, but possibly never really afforded the grace of humanity. So the next part of our exploration was important and crucial to my process also. We took it a step further and began to explore the archive and question it. When and where was it documented? Who is speaking? Who is absent? And most importantly to me, how does the archive speak? So in class, we began this exploration by choosing archival documents that spoke to us. And for my document here that you see on the screen, I acknowledge the importance of images to the practice by bringing in a map composed in 1857 by William Chambers in his book, American Slavery in Color. The map demonstrates through color codes and the states that were seen as free states, slave states, and undecided states. After reviewing this archive and asking the initial questions about it, I found that I was most interested in giving a voice to the silent presence of the map, the slaves. I began with a spoken word piece, which I will read for you now. Free state, slave state. The West Coast got it. The Midwest kinda got it. The Northeast got it. The South ain't got it. Who says I'm free? Either our humanity is inequivalent, so I'm bound, or you can't seem to choose between economy and common human decency, so I'm free-ish. Or I'm in the clear, but who's defining me? Who says I'm free? And do they know what freedom really means? Before this exploration, we read the article, The Question of Recovery. One thing that stood out to me immediately in this article was a quote from dictionary compiler Noah Webster. When asked about African history, he stated, of the woolly-haired Africans, there is no history and can be none. And I thought about Professor Lisa Jardine's definition of an archive as a secret and something hidden. And then I thought that it was very interesting that someone would say there is no history about a people they clearly have a vivid image and perspective and opinion of. If people like Webster wanted African history to remain secret and hidden, once again, I thought it was something of value both to time and space. So after receiving feedback on the first draft of allowing the archive to speak, I realized that my first attempt at the activity was more about the possible characters within the archive than it was about the way the archive itself spoke. So in my second attempt, I focused on the value of Black history to America and the disservice the bondage of any people does to all people in America, the nation as a whole, which is ironically a nod in a way to a historical quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I think I'm just now realizing that, but it was. And so this time I began to see a divided America as an injured physical body and wrote this short monologue. I am America, a wayward descendant of the motherland. I am the new land of the free. My body is a landscape of freedom. And although my left side is isolated in liberty, I can't quite wrap my head around it. My heart is conflicted, undecided. I cannot move forward because my dominant side is paralyzed and my feet are shackled, keeping me bound all over. Until all of me is free, I am just a facade of freedom. After that initial activity, we began exploring archival documents from Dr. Dominique Roger, I hope I said that correctly, that Kai translated, thank you, Kai. As she mentioned, they were French slave narratives, and I was given the opportunity and privilege to discuss those documents with another student, Miriam Lucian from Guadeloupe. And during our conversations, it was Miriam's understanding of the factual history surrounding the context of the documents that further helped me to understand the motives, objectives, and tactics of the characters represented in the documents, which is extremely important information for any actor approaching any role. So I applied this practice to my thesis process by locating a single image document that I could explore and question that would help me to further understand both the historical and fictional characters within the mountaintop, as you see here. I used this photo taken right after Dr. King had been assassinated on the balcony of his hotel room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. I saw the look of confusion and terror on the faces of those who stood at ground level, looking up onto a pedestal, but this one being a balcony of a rundown motel, watching Dr. King breathe his last breaths. I began to wonder if those bystanders could speak, what would they say? And to my aid, I found a few of the bystanders from the archive I was using had come forward since Dr. King's assassination and shared their memory of that tragic moment. One being Mary Ellen Ford, which you can see I kind of mapped out for you right there in the lower left corner of the picture. She was a waitress in the kitchen of the Lorraine Motel at that time. I was ultimately able to use her testimony, interviews where Katori Hall shared her research, and my own impulses upon viewing this image to reactivate the history surrounding the play, to breathe life into it and deliver an honest performance of a fictional character. So if you were to ask me what the importance of applying this practice of performing the archive was to my process of portraying Kamei, I would echo and paraphrase Toni Morrison and her essay, The Site of Memory. Truth is stranger than fiction, not truer, but stranger. The crucial distinction is not the difference between fact and fiction, but the distinction between fact and truth. Facts can exist without human intelligence, but truth cannot. So if I'm looking to find and expose a truth about the interior life of people who didn't write it, which doesn't mean that they didn't have it, then the approach that's most productive and most trustworthy is the recollection that moves from the image to the text, thus performing the archive. Thank you.
Thank you, Daja, for your wonderful reflections and for sharing your work with us as well. Next, we will hear from Jennifer Palmer, who is Associate Professor of History at UGA.
Great, thank you, Emily. And I just wanted to pick up on some of the points that Kai and Daja made that really beautifully illustrate the goals of this project. And as Emily indicated at the beginning, we have both pedagogical goals and research goals. And these are goals for the collaborators, for the initiators of the project, as well as for our students, hence our laboratory approach. So the first skill that we really thought was important to develop is analysis and close reading. And so Kai talked about how when she was translating the documents, she had to read them over and over and over again. And that as she read them, her response to them changed. And that her response changed again when she began to enact the documents in class, interacting with them physically. And so she began thinking about them in a very different, emotional, and personal way. And this ultimately allowed her to ask questions of very dry, legalistic documents, like the document that you see here, that she might not otherwise have asked, and that led her to a different perspective and a deeper analysis. Second, we wanted to center people who are generally marginalized in traditional written historical archives, particularly people who were enslaved. And so Daja mentioned, and also Kai mentioned, that she had never learned much in school about African American history. And Daja pointed out that what she did learn about it came from family members or storytellers. And so we have a notable contrast here. We have the absence of people of African descent in archives in relation to a very real presence of these same people in her life. And so through her own performance, she brings these together. And so her performance offers an alternative way to understand the past, but one that is grounded in archives and archival research. Third, we wanted to learn and generate knowledge collaboratively. And one of the things that both Kai and Daja talked about is the conversations they had with their partners at the University of the Antilles, and how these conversations deepened their understandings of the past and of the particular historical documents they were studying because of the different perspectives that they had. And we also used these techniques in class to generate knowledge collaboratively in the classroom. And so I just want to end by re-emphasizing two very important components of this project. It's interdisciplinarity, coming at the question of archives and performance from multiple disciplines allowed us to expand our disciplinary toolboxes, expand the techniques and tools that we could use to approach the question of the history and legacies of slavery. And also the collaboration with the University of the Antilles, which allowed us to think about the history and legacy of slavery across cultures and across national contexts, and even across languages. Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn things over to Caroline.
Hey everyone, can you hear me okay? Awesome. Okay, I'm about to send in a link. So today I'm going to play for y'all an audio play I created in the fall, and I've included in my little chat the link to the audio play as well as the script to the audio play if any of you want to follow along. I know, or you might want to just read it so that it's accessible, but I'm going to be playing it from my computer today. My name is Carolyn Caden. I'm a third-year undergrad here at UGA. I study theater, and I'm getting certificates in historic preservation and museum studies. So I'm super excited to share this work with y'all. I encourage you to also get your headphones out. I've got my big clunky headphones on. Please wear your headphones for this experience. It'll be the best that way. And just, I'm going to play it and make sure that you all can hear it first because you know how Zoom is. So let's see, share computer sound. And let me know if y'all can hear this okay, and then I'll start from the beginning.
This audio play is based on actual interviews with former slaves that...
Okay, are we good? We good on volume? Sweet. Okay. All right, I'm going to turn my camera off. But yeah, if y'all want to, close your eyes, do whatever makes you feel comfortable, please do. Oh, sorry. I don't know how to turn my camera off. Well, we might have my camera on. But all right, let's listen.
Occurred during 1936 to 1938. Conducted by the Federal Writers Project of the Works Progress Administration. Some characters in the play are fictional, and and some scenes and dialogue are omitted for creative and storyline purposes. This audio play is best experienced in the basement of the UGA library, but the story will find you wherever you choose to listen. Enjoy.
You are at the end of the day. Please rewind to get to the beginning of the day.
Date, December 3rd, 2019. Time, 1:35 a.m. Notes done by walterkovat, librarian, researcher, and part-time oral historian. This is me recording my own oral history, one with a little bit of family background. Tonight, I'm working in the basement of the UGA library, a rather dreary place, but mostly because no one is trying to use these old Dell computers. It's my least favorite place to be assigned my shifts, especially this late at night. But hey, I can do some family research without anyone disturbing me. Tonight, we explore my great-grandmother, Grace McCoon, a writer during the 30s for the Works Progress Administration, the program FDR started to help the working class during the Great Depression. Grace did her work here in Athens and lived right on College Avenue. Well, I found her interviews from her time there, and they're labeled slave narratives. I found copies of her notes from these interviews, and I don't know where to begin. What the hell? Is this a prank? Hello? God, I can't see anything. I only got 5% on my phone, not enough for the flashlight to work.
Stop looking for me, Walter. I'm right in front of you.
Who's there?
Your great-grandmother, Grace McCoon.
Ah, very funny, Rachel. You got me. Slacking on my work again. Now, can you please turn the lights on?
I don't know who Rachel is. I'm here to see you, Walter. And it's Grace. Ring a bell? You've been searching for me for hours.
Grace, if it's really you. What was your pet's name?
I didn't own any pets. Worked too much.
It's really you.
Odd question to ask for someone who spent so long digging up my past. I was enjoying my rest. Haven't been woken up for a while, but it seems you've opened a door into history that cannot be closed.
What do you mean?
This door has not been open in 63 years. Some haven't even looked inside. Those that have are long gone. Besides, I am only the messenger.
The messenger? You mean these narratives?
Yes. You already know so much about me. But what do you know of them?
Nothing, but can you please turn the lights back on so I can see you?
I'm sorry, but no. I had to get the energy from somewhere to be here. So that's the deal. No lights, no library, just this. You can't talk. You just have to observe. No noise whatsoever. Otherwise, the consequences could be dire. But I want you to ask yourself, are the people I'm interviewing telling me the truth?
Grace, wait, I have so many questions.
I'm going to take a picture of you, John. If only I could figure out how to work this camera. They hired me as a writer, not a photographer.
I should have gotten dressed up for the occasion, huh?
You look great as you are, and who knows if I even had the flash screwed in correctly. Let's take one more for good measure. That'll do.
Thank you. Grace, was it?
Yes, Grace McCoon. So you were going to tell me about your time with Henry Hull?
Yeah, Master Henry was a banker. He was one of them trustees at the university. I remember when the Yankees had come over the classic hills of Athens. Athens have so many hills. They would have been named Rome, except for that college.
What else did he do at that university?
Oh, he was teaching the kids numbers, equations, arithmetic. He was in charge of the whole thing.
Yes, I think I remember people talking about him being the chair of mathematics at the university.
He had a big house where my mama worked and had a 200-acre plantation where me and my daddy worked training the horses.
How was working on the plantation?
No, it was not a bad life. There was plenty we could do for fun. You stretch cowhides over a cheese box and make a tambourine, or break some bones off a cow and knock them together and call it a drum. Use some broom straws on a fiddle string, you got yourself an orchestra. Saturday, you could play baseball till it got dark. Then, drink and dance until it was time for Sunday go-to-meet. If you got sick, you got a cup of tea. Otherwise, it was just turpentine and castor for everything else. Unless you had a minor fracture, then Master sent the doctor out to the quarters.
How many people did you live with in your quarters?
Well, when you grow older, you take a woman. And if the woman wasn't willing, the master would make her take you. The marriages was thrifty and saved any actual purchase of new stock. Master Henry was good with numbers.
So what happened when you were freed?
Funny thing about freedom, don't mean much unless you got a place to go. My freedom is like that tree. You know that tree, the big oak up on Finley Street.
The tree that owns itself.
Yeah, that's the one. You see, that tree is free, but it can't go nowhere. I told Master Henry I was rooted in the soil. I'm going to stay fast rooted. And he let me work there on for another 20 years.
Your memory is so vivid, John. What's your secret?
Y'all government people always trying to figure out my secret. Long living come from leaving off from smoking and drinking. You know, death always comes in the afternoon. Mornings is for living. Death always comes in the afternoon. First, you hear an owl screeching. It's a sure sign of death. Then, it's the lowing of a cow in the meadow. That means death mighty close. When death come into a house, it stop the clock. Better for any man anywhere to bow down low to death. But I'm feeling quite tolerable. Thank you.
No, thank you, John. This has been great.
Why don't you come around back and get you some tomatoes out the garden?
Here I am, honey. Come right on through the house to the back porch. I'm just hanging up my clothes.
Are you Mrs. Mary Colbert?
Yes, honey, this is Mary. They say I'm old, childish, and hellish. Anyway, this is Mary.
Nice to meet you. Do you want to do the interview out on the front porch?
Dear, let's go in my parlor. I wouldn't dare go out on the front porch wearing a dirty dress. It simply isn't my way of living.
No problem at all, Mrs. Colbert.
Now, honey, take a seat. What is it you want me to tell you?
Well, why don't we start with where you were born?
Where I was born? Oh, my child. I was born right here in dear old hilly Athens, right in Marse John's backyard. Yes, that's where I was born. Polly Crawford was my mother, and she belonged to Major William H. Crawford before he gave her to his son, Marse John Crawford. Now, about my father, he died when I was just a little child.
I'm sorry to hear about your father. Where did you live?
It's all right. No use missing someone I never knew. Marse John lived in a 2-story frame house on Doherty Street, back at Scudder School. The 2 slave houses and the kitchen were set off from the house a little piece out in the yard. It was a style then to have the kitchen built separate from the dwelling house.
I see. I'd like to know a little bit about your experience with slavery. Did you ever receive any money during that time?
No, ma'am. There was never any money given to me in slavery time. Remember, dear, when the Yankees came through here, I was only 10 years old. Mrs. Fanny and Ann Crawford were Marse John's daughters, and they kept house for him. That morning in May, I was wearing a sleeveless apron, and they put a bag of gold and silver and some old greenback Confederate money in my apron and told me to hold on to it. Both of them patted me on the head and said, "Now be a good little girl and don't move." On came the bluecoats. They went all over the house, searching everything with their guns and swords shining and flashing. I was so scared, the sweat was running down my face in streams, bless your life. When they came to the bedroom when I was standing by a bed, holding that money inside my apron, they didn't even glance at me the second time. Little did they think that little slave girl had the money they were hunting for. After the Yankees were gone, I gave it all back to Miss Fanny, and she didn't give me the first penny.
Imagine if you were caught. How scared you must have been. Were your experiences with the family mostly like this?
No, Miss Fanny and Miss Ann were very kind to us, especially during Christmas. They had everything good you could want to eat. Listen, child, I'm telling you the truth. They even had pumpkin pie. Oh, yes, Santa Claus came to see slave children. Once I got too smart for my own good. Miss Fanny and Miss Ann told us to go to bed early. They said if we weren't asleep when Santa Claus got there, he would go away and never come back. Well, that night I made my mind up to stay awake and see Santa Claus. Miss Fanny and Miss Ann slipped into our quarters, right easy and quiet, and they were filling up our stockings with candy, dolls, and everything you can imagine. While they were doing that, they turned around and saw my eyes wide open. Right there, my Santa Claus ended.
Seems like you kept a lot of secrets for Miss Fanny and Miss Ann then, both big and small. What happened when you grew up and were freed?
Oh, yes. I was part of the family, secrets and all. When news came that we'd been freed, there was a happy jubilee time. Marse John explained the new freedom to his slaves, and we were glad and sorry too. My mother stayed with Marse John until he died. I was still a child and had never had to do anything more than play dolls and keep the children in the yard. Lord, honey, I had a fine time those days. When I grew up, I became a washerwoman for the white folks and married my first husband, Isaac Dixon. He came from someplace in Alabama and had been owned by Dr. Lipscomb, the chancellor of the University of Georgia. Dr. Lipscomb married us in the Colored Methodist Church, and I became a mother. Our 6 children were prettier than you, but only 3 of them lived to get grown. Our white folks named our children.
Wow, Dr. Lipscomb? You're throwing out some big names here.
We're all connected in some way or another. I've been with white folks all my life, and just let me tell you, I had the best white folk in the world, but it was by God's plan that we were set free. The truth as I see it is that Abraham Lincoln was an instrument of God sent to set us free.
You tell these stories well, Mrs. Colbert.
I've often considered writing the history of my life and finally decided to undertake it. But I found that it was more of a job than I had expected it to be, and then, too, I would have to tell too much. So I thought best to leave it alone. All the learning I have of writing and reading I got after we were made free. Yankee ladies came down from the north and taught us how to read and write in church.
Well, at least I got to hear about some of it, and you don't have to do the job of writing it all down. It was a delight.
Who's going to read these anyway?
To be honest, ma'am, other than my editor, I'm not quite sure yet. But they'll be stored in an archive, so your story won't be lost.
What is going on with my clock? It's only 20 past noon. It's not supposed to ring.
Perhaps it's a ghost.
I don't believe in haunts and ghosts. Since I've been grown, I have been around so many dead folk, I have learned that the dead can't harm you. It's the living that makes the trouble.
Hi, sir. Are you Willis Cover?
Why, yes, ma'am, it is. And who might you be?
I'm Grace McCoon. I'm writing for the WPA and was told you'd be interested in an interview. Is now a good time?
I suppose so. Just take a seat here.
Thanks. You have a lovely porch.
Thank you.
So let's get into this, shall we? Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I must admit, I'm a little shocked you want to hear from me. Seems like nobody really pays attention these days to old souls like me.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, Willis.
Call me Uncle. Everybody around here just calls me Uncle Willis.
All right then, Uncle Willis. Tell me about your family.
I was born in 1860, and at one time I had 3 brothers, but Caden and John died. My oldest brother, Ben Koff, is still living and preaching the gospel somewhere up north.
And did you all grow up as slaves?
Sure did. Boys just wore shorts that looked like dresses till they was 12 years old and big enough to work in the field. When a boy got to be man enough to wear pants, he drawed rations and quit eating out of the trough. All the boys were mighty proud when they got big enough to wear pants and go work in the fields with the grown folkses.
So what were the conditions like growing up?
All the slave quarters was log cabins, and little families had cabins with just one room. Beds for slaves was made by nailing frames built of oak and walnut planks to the side of the cabins.
How was the slave bidding process? Were you ever separated from your parents at all?
Old master wouldn't do nothing like that to us. He used to tell big tales of slaves when sometimes mammies would be sold off from their childrens. It was awful. They would just cry and pray and beg to be allowed to stay together. He said it wasn't right for the children to be taken away from their mammies.
Around how much would bids start off at?
They would put a black man on the scales and weigh him, and then bidding would start. If he was young and strong, the bidding would start around $150, and the highest bidder got him. A good young breeding woman brung $2,000, easy, because all the masters wanted to see plenty of strong, healthy children coming out all the time.
That's awful, Uncle Willis. I'm glad that you weren't separated from your family, though.
I suppose, but after the war was over, they just turned the slaves loose without nothing. Some of my family members stayed on with the old master and worked for a little money in their rations. Us started without nothing and had to go in debt to the white folks at first, but that was soon paid off. I never had no chance to go to school and get book learning. All the time us had work in the fields. Some of them came to Athens and helped lay bricks on the new building going up on Jackson Street.
Did you ever have a day off during the week? Perhaps Sundays?
Some Sundays. We went to the white folks' churches. Mr. Williams preached at the Baptist church on the first Sunday.
Would you go to the white churches to get baptized and married as well?
They waited till they had a crowd ready to get baptized, and then they took a whole Sunday for it. When slaves got married, the man had to ask the gal's ma and pa for her, and then he had to ask the white folks to allow them to get married. If they say yes, the white preacher married him. They had to change hands and jump over the broom, and they was married.
Because you shared the same church, were funeral ceremonies for everyone conducted the same way? Were slaves ever buried with their slave masters?
When white folks died, their funerals was preached before they was buried. For black folks, they waited about 2 months sometimes before they preached the funeral sermon. That was the onlyest difference between us. White folks put their slaves where they aimed to be buried themselves.
Where were most of the funerals you went to growing up?
The old graveyard on Jackson Street. I remember lots of folks that buried there. Both white folks and slaves too. That sure used to be a fine graveyard. Late one night, I was coming by the graveyard and seed something that looked like a dog. Except it wasn't no dog. It was white and went in a grave. It scared me, so I made tracks getting away from there in a hurry, and I ain't been round no more graveyards at night.
So you believe in ghosts then, Uncle Willis? What do you think happens to us when we die?
Us all going to get together someday. When us all leaves this old world. I'm ready to go. Just waiting for the Lord to call me home. And I ain't scared to face the Lord who will judge us all the same. 'Cause I done tried to do right. And I ain't afraid to die.
You know what? Me either. As long as our stories live on, I suppose we never will die, will we?
God bless you. Just put yourself in the hands of the Lord, for there ain't no better place to be. Goodbye, Missy.
You are at the end of the day. Please rewind to get to the beginning of the day.
Oh, goodness. Oh, sorry. Okay, let me go here and start my video. If y'all have any Q&A feedback, please put it in that Q&A section. I would love to address it in these last few minutes we got here. But I just wanted to show some photos, show some things that helped me in my project. Thank you all for listening and being a good audience. I know I can't see most of you, but I appreciate it. This is John Cole, the first person who we had like an interview by, and this is a photo of him in his front yard. So I read through many Works Progress Administration slave narratives and was, trying to find anything that would connect slaves to UGA, and finding names, trying to find people in my class in the fall. And one that was just super interesting to me was the Mary Colbert interview, which was the second interview that I showcased on the audio play. So I found the deep in-text citation and the connection to Dr. Lipscomb, who Lipscomb Hall is named after. So that's a dormitory in the middle of campus, and actually found the name of one of his slaves. So Mary Colbert was married to Isaac Dixon, which was one of his slaves, and he was considered the chancellor, but that today would mean the president of the university. So I found this connection, and I was just like, oh my gosh, because this was near the end of the semester, and I had been looking through so many papers and things, and oftentimes writing down people who were unnamed, but I had some of their story, and it was really, it's hard to look through these archives, as we heard from the first presenters, the bias that the people who were recording these things had. And so even these narratives were written by the interviewers. So they're as direct as they could be, but not necessarily perfectly direct, because these, interviewers were writing from their memory. So there are oftentimes some, language in here where it's this doesn't, sound right. And so it's looking through those biases and the archives to try to find what is true. But yeah, I want to just use these last few minutes for Q&A. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and let's see the question. So one of the questions is, were you able to gather any information about how these interviews were funded? So these interviews were funded by the Works Progress Administration, which is FDR's essential federal work program to make sure people get to work after the Great Depression. So these were conducted 1936 through 1938. And they had people, in the South, writers who were part of the Federal Writers Project. They would go around and conduct interviews, they would write things, and even places around the campus, certain murals that were made were commissioned by the Works Progress Administration, including the mural outside of the theater building that was made during that time. So there was a lot of art, a lot of writing, and interviews conducted during this time, and so that's how it was funded. And then there's another question that was directed to the first few people, but I want to direct it to them and also answer it too, because I think it applies to all of us. And the question is, have you ever changed your perspective after questioning, regarding questioning the archive and questioning the work? And if so, do you have to change the performance? So my answer to this is, this was a huge collaboration. I've worked with several amazing actors, and one of them I worked with, and she was in New York, but I had her just send recordings to me, Lauren King, who played Mary Colbert, and we were kind of emailing back and forth. And, I would pick certain things I wanted to highlight, but I also asked my actors, what do you want to highlight and what do you think is interesting about this? And it was this, really big collaboration of looking through these and seeing what these people actually said and questioning what we want to include and the stories that we want to showcase. And so my perspective, when I was reading through these, I think the perspective of when they're oh, my owners were good, but it was God's plan to be set free, reading through these and being whoa, this is as close to a recording, I guess, we could get, was very insightful. And we were trying to figure out how do the actors, how are they going to perform this archive? And they had to determine in their mind, what would this person sound like? What would they do? So we would change the way, sometimes we would change recordings, we would redo things to give it. What do y'all think, everyone else on the board, about changing your work after reading the archive? I know we might be out of time, but sorry.
No, I would thank you, Caroline, and I would like to invite others to respond to that, or just to make any other last statement or comment, as we are out of time, but there's certainly time to make one last statement. Would anyone like to speak?
I mean, if I could answer that question, in our work, we're really process oriented. And so the performance is always changing. The performance is never finished. And performance is a tool for this collaborative meaning making. So I would say absolutely. I don't know if Daja and Kai agree, having done the work. Thanks.
Well, if I don't see any microphones going off, then I will thank this wonderful panel. Going, gone? Anyone? All right, I'm going to thank you. And I'm also going to invite you to please stay. And Emily, this idea of collaborative meaning making, I think that is what we are engaged in here in general in the symposium for these 2 days. So I invite everyone who is with us at the moment and panelists to please stick around. At 2:15, we will have a Below Baldwin and Beyond Baldwin panel that will feature both the film that in many ways helped get us started in this symposium and in this larger dialogue, along with the student group that's moving forward into demands around economic justice in Athens. So, on we go for more collaboration and meaning making and repair. So thank you all, and enjoy. See everyone in a few minutes.